The rain tapped softly against the glass walls of Nova Access Corporation's towering headquarters, like nature itself was trying to warn me. I remember watching the droplets slide down the pane beside my desk, each one racing the others to the bottom. I used to imagine they were alive little brushstrokes trying to outrun time. But that morning, there was no room for daydreams. Had a gut feeling. I should have listened. The office felt unusually still. Even the usual clatter of keyboards and the fake laughter from the break rooms seemed muted. Whispers floated down, the hallway like smoke curling under doors, clinging to shoulders. Something was coming. We all felt it at exactly 10:15 a.m. An email pinged into the team inbox. Mandatory all-hands meeting, conference room 7. Effective. Mita Lee grabbed my notepad out of habit, not needed, and walked with the rest of the team to the glass-walled room at the end of the corridor. I tried to hide the tension in my hands, but my stomach already knew. Inside, people sat stiff as statues. Stephen Kolth, a man who could make entire departments tremble with a single raised. I browsed in with 2 HR reps trailing behind. Him like shadows. He wore his usual navy suit and that cruel half-smile that made your skin crawl. "Thank you for being here," he began, voice calm but razor-sharp. "As part of our ongoing strategic alignment, we've had to make some difficult decisions regarding departmental efficiencies." Then his eyes locked onto mine. "Camille Turner," he said, slow and deliberate. "After a thorough performance review, it has been determined that your role is no longer aligned with the goals of this company. Effective immediately. Your position has been terminated." Silence. Utter, crushing silence. The kind that makes your heartbeat slam in your ears. I felt the blood drain from my face. My mouth was dry. I couldn't even swallow Dot. No one looked at me. Not Susan from accounting, who once cried in my office after a breakup. Not Jared, whose promotion I'd helped secure. Not even Linda, who sat next to me for 4 years and borrowed my mug every morning. They all stared at their laps like children, hoping to disappear. "You may collect your belongings," Stephen continued, already flipping to the next slide, as if he were talking about printer maintenance, not dismantling someone's dignity in public. I stood, but my legs trembled. Each step toward the exit felt like wading through wet cement. When I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, I saw him, James Carter, the janitor, 60-something, always polite, always invisible to everyone else. He stood at the far end with his mop cart, hands folded, waiting. Our eyes met, no pity. They're just calm, like he already knew. I tried to smile, but my lips shook. He walked toward me slowly, reached into his pocket, and pulled out something small. When he opened his hand, a slightly rusted golden key lay in his palm. "It's time," he whispered. Dot, I blinked. "Time for what?" He smiled gently. The kind of smile that comes from knowing a secret. "To breathe, Camille," he said. To finally breathe. I used to think crayons were magic. When I was 5, my mother brought home a small box of colored pencils from the dollar store. They were dull at the tips, smelled faintly of wood glue, and had no brand name but to me. They were pure gold. I'd sit on the creaky wooden floor of our tiny living room in rural North Carolina, drawing mountains I'd never seen, oceans I'd only heard about on TV, and creatures from books borrowed from the church library. My parents were simple people. Mom cleaned houses, Dad worked shifts at a paper mill. They loved me, but not in a way that left room for dreams. They loved me in a way that feared Bill's risk. "And anything uncertain. You draw real nice," my dad said once, glancing at one of my sketches on the fridge. "But art don't feed the stomach, Camille. You need a job that'll keep you off your knees." I didn't understand what "off your knees" meant then. I do now. By 12, my bedroom walls were covered in sketches. I drew on napkins, homework backs, brown paper bags, anything I could find. Late at night, I'd work under the dim light of a broken desk lamp, feeling alive. like the paper was the only place I belonged, in middle school. My teacher, Ms. Reynolds, pulled my parents aside on parent-teacher night. I sat outside, eavesdropping, as she told them I had real talent, that there were scholarships, that art could be a future. My mother thanked her. My father stayed quiet until the car ride home. We can't afford foolishness, Camille. You want? To end up broke, begging, 30 years old and still living in our house. That night, I put away my sketchbook for a week. I didn't draw a single line. It felt like holding my breath underwater, each day heavier than the last. In high school, I worked part-time at a diner, saving for college. I chose business administration not because I loved it, but because it was safe. Because people said I could always draw on weekends, but I didn't. Most weekends. I was too tired or too guilty by 21. I had an associate's degree, a small scholarship, and a bank job. I'd earned my family's approval. I lost pieces of myself along the way. One spring break, I visited an art exhibit at a small community college. I wandered past rows of canvases, paint piled thick like frosting, colors leaping from the walls. I stopped in front of one abstract piece and stared so long the janitor asked if I was lost. I was. I didn't say it out loud, but I was by 24. I had landed a full-time job at Nova Access Corporation in the finance department. Full benefits, steady pay, a cubicle with my name neatly printed on a placard. My father said, "Now that's something to be proud of." I smiled, but inside something small and bright flickered one last time before it went dark. When I first walked into Nova Access, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd made peace with my choices. The building was all glass and steel, reflecting the sky like it had nothing to hide. Inside, everything smelled of fresh carpet and ambition. Polished surfaces, silent elevators, perfect people in pressed shirts and expensive shoes. They gave me a cubicle in the finance department with a view of a brick wall and a printer that jammed every single day. My work was spreadsheets, forecasting. Endless meetings where men in tight suits argued over decimal points and cost optimization. No one ever spoke about beauty, creativity, or the soul. Still, I told myself this was adulthood. This was success. But I couldn't shake the itch in my fingers. On lunch breaks, I started sneaking out to the small back garden behind the building, a quiet patch of grass and 3 lonely benches. I kept a worn sketchpad in my bag. Under the shade of a stubborn magnolia tree, my hands remembered what my heart had almost forgotten. I sketched the sharp lines of the building, the way sunlight danced on concrete, the slump of someone checking their phone in secret. I didn't draw for purpose. I drew to survive. That's where I met James. He was pushing a mop bucket along the edge of the building when he saw me. He stopped, leaned on the handle, and tilted his head toward my sketchbook. "You've got the light," he said, his voice rough but kind. My Ellie used to draw like that. I didn't know what to say. No one in the office ever spoke to James. Most didn't even know his name. I just nodded, and that was enough. From then on, we talked whenever we crossed paths. He told me about Ellie, his late wife, a Sunday painter who never tried to sell her work, never cared if it was good enough. She painted because she had to. As James put it, it was the only way she could breathe. She had a studio in the old tool shed out back. He swore it had the best light in the county. He never touched it after she passed. Couldn't bring himself to dot at first. I only listened. In return, I told him little pieces about myself, how I used to draw on paper bags as a kid, how I'd been accepted to an art program but turned it down, how no one at work knew I even owned a pencil. He never judged me, never told me I'd been foolish. He just said, "Ellie would have liked you." Over the years, our conversations became my anchor, the only real moments in days filled with corporate jargon and polite, artificial smiles. My coworkers barely noticed me unless they needed a report fixed or a file located. I was dependable, quiet, invisible, exactly how Stephen liked his staff. But James saw me, not the employee. Not the spreadsheet girl. Me. Sometimes I think he knew before I did that something inside me was slowly dying and that one day I'd need a way back. I used to count the windows in the office tower across from mine, 55 of them, each one a square of someone else's life. I wondered if any of them ever looked back at me. Maybe I'd stopped being visible a long time ago. 4 years ago, things at Nova Access began to shift. Restructuring, they called it. More meetings, tighter deadlines, fewer people. Those who survived didn't celebrate. They just worked harder, smiled less, aged faster. I was one of them. The lucky ones. Stephen Cole had always been unpleasant, but after the layoffs, he sharpened like he'd tasted blood and wanted more. His eyes scanned every room like a predator looking for the slowest in the herd. And for some reason, he chose me. He'd call me out in meetings for missing the bigger picture, even when I wasn't the one presenting. He'd copy upper management on tiny mistakes that didn't matter. And when I got things right, he said nothing. Silence was his weapon. And I foolishly took it. I told myself he was just stressed, that everyone was. If I worked harder, he'd back off. It didn't matter. No matter how early I arrived, how late I stayed, how perfectly I formatted those wretched spreadsheets, he kept coming. And I kept shrinking. My sketch pad, once tucked safely in my bag, ended up buried in the back of a drawer. I hadn't touched it in months, every time I thought about drawing again. I heard my father's voice in my head. Art doesn't feed the stomach. Some mornings I'd stare in the bathroom mirror and barely recognize the woman looking back, hollow cheeks, tired eyes, a suit that fit too well because I'd worn it too long. Somewhere along the line, I traded color for compliance, breath. For balance sheets, I started eating lunch alone, not because I wanted to, but because no one noticed when I stopped showing up in the break room. My voice grew quieter. My laugh disappeared. I began to disappear. James noticed. At first he didn't say much, just watched me as he passed in the hallway. One day, he stopped and said, "You're walking like you've got chains around your ankles." I forced a weak smile. "Just tired, James." He didn't smile back. "No, Camille, it's not tired. It's something heavier." I wanted to cry right there in front of the janitor with his mop and his eyes that saw too much. But I didn't. I swallowed it like I always did and walked away that night. I went home, opened my drawer, and pulled out the sketch pad. I stared at the blank page for a long time, but my hand wouldn't move. It hovered over the paper like a ghost. I didn't know where to begin, or if I was even allowed to begin anymore. I closed the book and put it back. Some people burn out in flames. Me? I was burning out quietly, fading one spreadsheet at a time. I don't remember much of the walk back to my desk, just the cold hum of fluorescent lights and the sharp click of my heels, echoing louder than they should have. My name still hung in the air like a bruise. Camille Turner. Terminated, effective immediately, like I was a spreadsheet reviewed, deemed irrelevant, and deleted. A cardboard box was already waiting on the edge of my desk. HR efficiency at its finest. Someone had even started packing for me. My framed photo of Mom, the ceramic mug that read "Introverts Unite." Separately, the little plant I'd coaxed through for winters, and my sketch pad, dusty, untouched, still closed. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the fragments of a life I no longer belonged to. Around me, people kept typing like nothing had happened. No one made eye contact. No one said goodbye. That was what hurt the most, not the job, not Stephen's smug voice, but the silence. The way 30 people could pretend you'd never existed. I placed the last few items in the box, lifted it into my arms, and began the walk down the main hallway for the last time. Each step felt heavier than the one before. I didn't know where I was going home, maybe to the car, or into some abyss where all the invisible women go. Then I saw him. James stood just beyond the hallway bend, next to his mop cart, watching me. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. He already knew. He walked toward me slowly, gently took the box from my arms, and set it on a bench by the wall. Then, with a steady hand, he reached into the front pocket of his gray uniform and pulled out a small object. A key dot. It looked old, golden, with rust fringing the edges, the kind you'd find in an attic or a storybook. He held it out in his palm like it was something sacred. "It's time," he said softly. I blinked. Time for what? James's eyes met mine. There was no pity there, no sadness, only calm, and something else. Something like conviction. "To breathe," he said. "Ellie always told me breathing isn't just about the lungs, it's about the soul. That studio's been waiting for you, Camille. Far too long." My throat tightened. Studio? Then handed me a folded piece of paper with an address written in careful block letters. 18 Sycamore Lane. Looked down at the key, then back at him. I don't understand." "You don't need to," he said. "Not yet." I stood there frozen, the key warm in my hand, like it had been waiting for my palm all this time. No one had ever handed me anything like this before. Not a key. Not trust, not belief. James smiled a soft, weathered smile. "It's yours now." Ellie would have wanted it that way. He didn't wait for thanks, didn't make a speech, just turned and pushed his cart down the hallway, disappearing, like always quiet, constant, kind. And I stood there clutching a key to a place I'd never been. But that somehow already felt like home. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, the key still in my hand, its worn metal pressing into my skin. I must have turned it over 100 times, as if holding it long enough might whisper its purpose into my ears. Severance pay, unemployment forms, rent. The practical part of my brain screamed, focus on survival. But the rest of me, the part I thought had gone silent, long ago whispered something softer. Go. Around midnight, I got in my car and drove. The streets were empty, rain trailing down the windshield in slow, lazy lines. Street lamps passed overhead like ghosts. I followed James's directions left on Maple, right past the old train depot. Then down a quiet street lined with sagging porches and sleeping houses. 18 Sycamore Lane was a modest home with a small front yard, a crooked mailbox, and a garden gnome missing one eye. It looked ordinary, the kind of place people forget exists. But at the end of the gravel path, behind the main house, stood a small detached building with faded blue siding and a slanted roof. A warm yellow porch light glowed above its door. I stepped out of the car, the key clutched tight in my fist. The lock was stubborn. I had to jiggle it twice before it gave way with a soft click. The door creaked open. Inside, the air smelled of old paint, cedar, and time. It was a single room, maybe the size of a small classroom, but it felt vast. Sunlight must have poured in during the day through the tall windows, now cloaked in gauzy curtains. Wooden shelves lined the walls, cluttered with jars of dried brushes, tubes of half-used paint and sketchbooks stacked like diaries. A canvas stood in the center of the room, covered by a sheet. I didn't touch it. Instead, I let my fingers trail over the worn work table, dusty charcoal pencils, a folded apron, a cracked ceramic mug still rimmed with paint. This place wasn't just a room. It was a life paused mid-breath. On the table, tucked beneath a jar of buttons, I found an envelope with my name written in slanted, careful script. Inside was a letter from James. Camille, Ellie always believed this studio had a soul. She said the walls soaked up every brushstroke, every sigh, and gave it back tenfold. When she passed, I couldn't bear to step inside again. But when I saw you sketching behind the building that day, I knew you've got the same light in your eyes. This space, it's yours now. Not charity, recognition. You are an artist, even if the world tried to convince you otherwise. Is too short to live someone else's dream. James' sigh sank into the nearest chair, my chest heaving with a mix of grief and something dangerously close to hope. For a long while, I just sat there. Then, without thinking, I reached for a pad of paper in the drawer. My hands moved on their own, trembling slightly. I found a stick of charcoal cracked but still usable, turned to a fresh page, and drew a line. It was jagged, too hard. Not perfect, but it was mine, and for the first time in years I felt like I was breathing again. It started with one line, then another, and another. Every morning I returned to Ellie's studio like it was church. The sun poured through the tall windows, catching motes of dust that danced like whispers from her past. I didn't plan what I drew, I just let my hands remember. At first it felt like exhaling after years of holding my breath. I drew what I saw: cracked teacups, flowers from the garden's gentle slope curved with the line of James's back as he watered the tomatoes. I filled page after page, sometimes with nonsense, sometimes with fury. Some drawings I tore up before the ink even dried. Others I kept, taping them to the wall like small affirmations. You are still here. You still matter. James would stop by now and then. Sometimes with a sandwich, sometimes with nothing but his quiet presence. He never interrupted. He would just sit in the corner, humming low and tuneless like a heartbeat. You've got more color in your cheeks, he said once, handing me a cup of peppermint tea. I think it's charcoal dust, I joked. He smiled, but gently. No, it's something else. I wasn't earning anything yet. The severance package from Nova Access would keep me afloat for a while, and I dipped into savings I'd imagined, using on some far-off rainy day. Apparently that rainy day had arrived. Still, there was fear. Always fear. Fear that I was wasting time, that the money would run out, and this fragile, beautiful thing I had found would vanish. Whenever doubt crept in, I'd walk to the corner where Ellie's old smock still hung from a hook. I'd touch the worn fabric, stained in reds, blues, and greens, and remember that someone had lived here before me, and she had dared. The first time I sold a piece was almost an accident. James's niece, Angela, stopped by with her newborn. One afternoon, I sketched the baby's profile just for practice. She saw it and asked if she could buy it. It's just a sketch, I said, embarrassed. It's him, she replied. That's enough. She paid me $60. I cried after she left, not because of the money, but because someone had looked at something I made and seen value. It changed me. Word spread slowly. Angela told her friends. One posted a few things online. I built a simple website, nothing fancy, just a portfolio and a contact form. Orders began to trickle in. Pet portraits, nursery art, illustrations for someone's self-published poetry book. I started saying yes to things I would have once laughed at. A mural for a cafe, a painting of someone's backyard garden, a logo. Design, I was learning to live by brushstroke, by color, by gut. Within 6 months, I had a small list of returning clients. I was making enough to cover rent, and yes, I insisted on paying rent to James. Even though he grumbled every time I handed him the envelope, I bought new supplies, painted the walls a soft cream, installed brighter lights, but I left the heart of the place untouched. Ellie was still here, in the quiet corners, in the way the room held warmth like a memory, on a shelf above my work table. I placed a black and white photograph I'd found in one of her sketchbooks, Ellie laughing, in front of a canvas, hands covered in paint. Some days I'd whisper thank you to it, just so she knew. The fear never vanished. It lingered at the edges, especially during slow weeks, but every time I held a pencil, I felt stronger. I wasn't where I wanted to be, but for the first time, I wasn't running from who I was, and that was enough. 3 years passed, and the studio became my world. The name Camille Turner began appearing in local newsletters and gallery corners, usually followed by a modest line. Charming local artist known for evocative line work and emotion-driven portraits. I laughed the first time I read it. Me, known. As if the quiet girl in the cubicle had ever imagined such a thing. Work was steady enough that I needed help. A college intern came in twice a week for admin and scheduling. I art shipped to 3 states. 3 cafes displayed my murals. None of it was flashy, none of it was easy, but it was mine, and all of it. Every brushstroke led back to him. James still visited, though less often now. His knees gave him trouble, and the winter air made his joints ache. But when he did come, he walked through the studio like a man entering a chapel. I think in his mind it still belonged to Ellie. In a way, it did. Maybe now it belonged to both of us. One morning, while rearranging supplies, I found a small, creased photograph tucked in a drawer I hadn't opened in months. It showed a younger James and Ellie by a lake, arms around each other, smiling so easily it stole my breath. He looked more relaxed. She looked radiant, cheeks full of joy, hands smudged with paint. There was so much life in that photo, and so much loss. An idea took root. It wasn't a commission. It wouldn't be paid for. It had no deadline. But the moment I touched the paper, I knew it might be the most important thing I'd ever make. For weeks between orders and online workshops, I worked on it in secret. I didn't recreate the photograph. I reimagined it. I painted James and Ellie as they might be now, older, wrinkles deeper, hair whiter, but still together, still laughing by that lakeside bench. Her hand in his, still painting, still whole. The day I finished, I cried. Not from sadness, from something deeper, something like closure. I called James and told him I had something to show him. He arrived in his best jacket, the brown corduroy, with elbow patches. His hands trembled slightly as he held the warm mug of tea I offered. I led him to the back room, where the painting stood covered by a linen cloth. "I have a gift for you," I said. He looked at me with tired but kind eyes. "Camille, you don't owe me anything." No," I replied softly. "But I owe her." I pulled the cloth away. James stared. His body went still, as if even breathing might shatter the moment. His eyes filled, then spilled over. Without touching the canvas, he steadied himself against the table. "How?" he whispered. "How did you know?" "I found the photo and," said quietly, "the rest was imagination and gratitude." He nodded, unable to speak. We stood in silence as the painting glowed beneath the skylight. Ellie's eyes sparkled with that mischievous joy I imagined she'd carried her whole life. And James, he looked like the man I knew, only a little more at peace. After a long pause, he turned to me, voice trembling. "You didn't just give me a painting," he said. "You gave her back to me." I reached out, took his hand, and whispered, "And you gave me a future." These days, I wake up before the sun, not because I have to, but because I want to. The studio is quietest in the early morning, before emails, before orders, for the world remembers I exist. I make coffee, pull on my paint-streaked hoodie, and sit by the tall window with a fresh canvas and a soul that finally knows peace. Sometimes I still hear echoes of that old office life, the clicks of keyboards, Stephen's flat voice, the weight of feeling invisible. But they've grown faint, like voices from a house I no longer live in. I haven't spoken to anyone from Noviaxis since the day I walked out. No one ever reached out, no apologies, no closure. And honestly, I don't need it because what I have now is better. A few weeks ago, a children's book publisher called they'd seen my portfolio online. One of my illustrations had been shared in a parenting group, and they offered me a long-term contract. Not for just one book, but a whole series. When I hung up, I sat in the middle of the studio floor, surrounded by brushes, fabric, and scraps of ideas. And I laughed, big, open, ridiculous laughter that echoed off the walls like a choir. I didn't even realize I was crying until I tasted salt on my lips. Ellie would have loved that moment. So would James. I still keep her photo on the shelf, beside a fresh jar of brushes and a tiny sketch of the magnolia tree I used to sit under behind the Noviaxis building. Full circle, but better, because now the tree lives only in memory, and the memory belongs to me. Last week, a young woman named Alyssa stopped by the studio. She'd been following my work online and asked if I ever took apprentices. She looked like me years ago, eyes full of something wild and quiet, fingers fidgeting with the sleeve of her thrift store sweater. I said yes, because someone once made space for me, and now it's my turn. That night, as I stood alone in the studio, I caught my reflection in the tall window. My hair was in a messy bun, and there was paint on my cheeks, my fingertips even my neck, and I looked alive. Not perfect, not rich, not famous. But Scene. James once told me, the right doors open at the right time, but it's up to us to have the courage to walk through them. Back then, I didn't understand. Now I do. Sometimes the door is re-lolled and rusted behind a quiet house on Sycamore Lane. Sometimes it's a canvas, or a sketch pad, or a single trembling line drawn in the dark. But it's always the moment. You stop asking for permission to be who you are. The world didn't give me that. Key James did. Ellie did. And now I hold it, not with fear, but with purpose, because I know who I am now. I'm Camille Turner. I'm an artist, and I'm home.